the question and answer part, and I've seen some stuff come up, and I think David, there was a question from Anthony about carbon flex. I'm wondering if you kind of, I think, partially sort of went into answering that, but could you kind of paraphrase maybe a little bit what the question was for those that haven't been able to read through it before you go into your answer?
Yeah, so Anthony asked about which carbon pools are being accounted for. So a lot of folks, as they start to get into forest carbon, realize pretty quickly that, like, if you actually just looked at like the top meter of soil around the world, there's more biomass and carbon in that than everything above it. So a lot of people often kind of get attracted to that and say, obviously that's a huge deal. What's going on in soil? What's going on with natural disturbance? So what are you actually accounting for? What about products, things like that? And my response was, we're just looking at observable change in above ground live trees. So most of the data that's being produced from satellite monitoring, for example, is quantifying how much of the live trees changing over time. So there are pools that are not being tracked associated with that, dead trees, below ground biomass, et cetera. And as it relates to harvested wood products, we basically intentionally left that scope to the existing LCA and EPDs. So we're just trying to say, take that zero that's currently being used to assume all forests that are sustainably managed are exactly carbon neutral and replace it with a real number based on observable change. So we're kind of giving this factor that can add another line item to your impact factor for your cubic meter of glulam or whatever it is that you're ultimately using.
Could I maybe add to that question?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks for that response. So one of the things that I'm grappling with is, like, as I look at BC's emissions and how they report it, right? There's like a lot of line items that are not included in the emission inventory. And so even when you look at forests, there's, you know, they include in the inventory afforestation and deforestation. That's included.
Yeah.
But then they have other factors that's not included, such as forest growth minus decay, which is usually, which I assume is kind of what you're looking at in a way, right? You're trying to figure out what's the carbon flux in the forest. And we actually have data at the provincial scale reported on that, right?
Right.
But then there's also things like slash burning emissions. There's things like wildfire disturbances, which are extremely significant in BC and probably in many other areas, right? I understand that's a natural disturbance. And there's a question as to even like, is that 100% natural disturbance and there's 0% in human intervention? Do we automatically move forests into that column when there's a, you know, above 20 or 30% tree mortality, and then so now it's off our books and so we don't count for it? But do our forest management practices also influence it? I think that's an important question, is because oftentimes the conversation tends to be that climate change is making, you know, it's getting hotter and drier, and so it's, and we have too much fuel load in the forest, and there's kind of one direction of that narrative. But then there's very rarely do we talk about what are we doing in our forest management practices, and is that making our forests more or less wildfire susceptible, right? So I guess one of the thoughts that I had was that, like, if we already have this stuff reported at the provincial scale, is there potential for incorporating this at a landscape level calculation, like an A0? I totally understand there's probably no consensus right now as to which of these factors to include. So one of the things that I looked at is potentially, because I just did some modeling for the province on kind of province-wide embodied carbon, and I tried to include some of these factors and trying to look at, you know, what happens if we know. I'm just trying to paint scenarios. If we don't include wildfires, what if we include 10% of the wildfires? What if we include 100%? Like, just to give a sense of how much that would sway the numbers, which would obviously swing it in crazy ways. And I was doing 5-year rolling averages of these A0 factors. But I guess just when we're looking at the landscape level, you can kind of cherry pick a certain portion of it, but obviously there's other carbon fluxes happening in the forest. And so I guess that's my, I'm not expecting you to necessarily answer all of it, but maybe these are things that need to get discussed at the technical advisory group, but that's, I think they're important questions to dive into.
Yeah, absolutely. I've just dropped an article in the chat as well, which kind of lays out in more detail how the Canadian government approaches trying to untangle natural disturbance from this. And I would say what's interesting about it too is that this type of reporting is occurring under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it's not explicitly trying to get at the embodied carbon of forest products, right? So when they're talking about which lands are included, they're including areas that they deem to be managed because there's wildfire suppression that occurs on them. So these could be areas that are otherwise reserved or protected from commercial timber harvest. So when you look at those impact factors, they're including lands that are not producing timber and that are kind of prohibited from producing timber. So this is kind of one of the insertion points that kind of, I think, complicates the ability to use the publicly reported data. But you've kind of got these, like Jake was describing for the levels of disclosure, you've got like varying levels of confounding that you can isolate progressively. And so this is one where the best that you might currently have available is not spatially explicit beyond just the provincial scale. But I will say from chatting with the Natural Resources Canada folks, they are transitioning to a spatially explicit accounting system to where they should be able to report on a much more granular scale with the next round of disclosures, what's happening where within a province. So I think you should be able to get more detailed outputs like that start to get at what you're talking about. But basically what they propose in here is that if they want to exclude wildfire and pest emissions when there's a significant impact, right? So if it's just happening within 10% of what the existing forest stocks are, they ignore it. But if there's like a dramatic carbon impact associated with a wildfire or catastrophic pest outbreak, they will ignore that or kind of set it into a different bucket until a human intervention happens, right? So if there's a catastrophic wildfire this year and you don't do anything with it this year, but next year you come in and salvage log it, then it shows up, right? The stock change that's due to the salvage logging will show up. But the year in which the wildfire happened is being left off the balance sheet. So it's,
Can I make a point here, which is, I mean, forests are endlessly complex. And, I think one of the highest order questions is what kind of information do we need that's good enough to make directionally and hopefully order of magnitude appropriate decisions to sequester more carbon, make forests more resilient, and it's tricky because you can continue to study this for a long time, but then the forests are going to burn and the climate's going to change and we're not going to make the kind of impact that we could have. Or you can use these big continental generic averages, just put 0 in, and you might be wrong most of the time, and in fact directionally wrong at least some of the time. And so, what does good enough look like? Obviously there's going to be people like Anthony, who I assume is a researcher of some variety, and David, who are, really important behind the scenes figuring this stuff out. But what we're trying to do with the greenhouse gas protocol and with FSC and with the Climate Smart Wood Group is figure out what's good enough for the average project team who's trying to do good in the world and make a smart decision about the wood package that moves us in the right direction from where we are right now. And it's obviously a subjective choice, and we haven't quite figured it out. But anyway, I just it can be totally, you can get spun up on this stuff because it's endlessly complex.
But I would say that the whole thing about order of magnitude, I think that's an important point, because these things are order of magnitude directions, right? Like total embodied carbon in BC is maybe 8 megatons, total economy wide is 68, wildfires is 200, right? So it's like these are extremely significant factors. You can imagine if you incorporate any amount of that emissions into your calculations, it would blow your LCA up, right? Like it would. So they're very significant.
And
it also points out that more carbon is not always better. I mean, as David brought up.
Yeah, I think similar to what Jake described with one of their timber suppliers, we don't, we want to provide more information about embodied carbon impacts in forests, but don't want that to be like a goggles that you put on that blind you from everything else that should actually guide your procurement decision making. So carbon is like one indicator that you should think about. But there's certainly going to be instances where if you looked at British Columbia, for example, or the east side of British Columbia, and saw these wild carbon emission numbers, I don't want you to come away with that saying, I shouldn't ever buy wood from fire-prone forests, right? That's not the takeaway message, that you should be getting from this. So I think it's mostly just tempering kind of how much you expect to get out of your LCA, and that it's that can't and shouldn't be the single driver for how and why you choose to purchase wood from different suppliers.
Thanks.
So Adam Slivers put a question in the chat, and Adam, I don't know if you want to unmute just to repeat your question quickly.
Sure, thanks, Shana. I just I feel like we're all in this group trying to encourage growth and optimization of the carbon stored in the forest. And then also because, personally, I'm in the construction industry, I'm going to want to harvest some of that. And so we're kind of dealing with those two forces. So to that end, which is the best way to assign that carbon stored in the forest that stays in the forest, all the other, parts that we're talking about, not the forest products? Should we assign that stored carbon to the timber being harvested and sold? Does it benefit the owner better there? Or do we account for it as part of a land use that could be sold as a carbon offset? I see that Jake and David, and well, maybe all, I don't know. I wonder how all the three presenters are, it seems like it's being attributed to the product being sold. And does that benefit kind of our endeavor to grow the forest the best?
Yeah, really good question. I think I might try to pick up Will's question here in my answer as well too, is about how do we account for the part of the tree that doesn't make it into the product. And so basically the way that we're approaching it right now is that there's a line item for the carbon that's in the product in your existing LCA or EPD. So if you buy a cubic meter of glulam, you know what the physical carbon storage is inside that. You should be able to find out, this is part of the work that Upstream has been doing, that Jake has been working on, is to figure out how much logs went into that, so that from the raw biomass that was in the log, how much of that was emitted in the processing of the material. So sometimes that's included in EPD, sometimes it's not. But so that starts to get, I think, hopefully to Will's question there, is that there should be a way for you to identify how much roundwood or logs went into your product, and then how much you left with at the end of it. That doesn't get at the question of what's going on in the forest, with the tops of trees and the bark and the roots and stuff like that that are left to decay. That's what we capture implicitly by just monitoring how much has the tree carbon changed over time. So if you have a harvest and the branches and the roots and the bark are left on the site to decay, it's not going to show up the next time you do your monitoring estimation of what's the live tree standing carbon. So that is essentially being accounted for as if it was being lost or emitted to the atmosphere. And I think back to Adam's question, what we're basically trying to do with our research intervention is to say, yes, you shouldn't say, oh, is my forest sustainable or not sustainable, therefore I'll ignore the carbon that's in the product. That doesn't make any sense. There is carbon in the product. You should account for that. The question is whether or not the forest that the wood came from is increasing or decreasing, and whether that adds a carbon burden that you should also be accounting for, or a carbon benefit that you should be accounting for.
I guess I would also say that right now it's a bit of a Wild West scenario where people are making all sorts of claims based on all sorts of analysis, and frankly mixing landscape level research with product level claims. And that's another place where the greenhouse gas protocol is going to be very explicit on what kind of claims can come from what kind of research. I think Jake's point that it's both and, I think, is totally right. And it probably ties to what your client wants to say. If you're making a zero carbon building claim, then it's a product level claim based on all the products you're bringing together and probably the offsets that you buy to deal with the emissions you can't avoid. And that's a product level analysis. You can't then mix that with a landscape level claim, because that would effectively start to be a bit of double counting. If what you're trying to say is, our sourcing of small diameter wood restored this forest, or our sourcing of this kind of wood led to an increase in, biodiversity habitat and carbon storage on the landscape, well, then that's obviously landscape level research that you're doing. But right now, people are taking, landscape level data, 20% more carbon in the forest, and saying, well, I'm going to just associate it with that with a 20% reduction in carbon stored, in the product from that forest. But that's not accurate. And, right now we have kind of a fair bit of gray zone. And I think where we need to move is much more explicit about what kind of claim are you trying to make, and then what kind of research and data do you need to do to make that claim. And it exists. It's why FSC is doing LCA studies and regional studies, because that's kind of the two different approaches.
But I want to jump in here and just sort of like talk about one reason why I said yes and is because the carbon markets will catch up. They're not there yet to be a robust enough incentive to really drive behavioral change, which is why we get into a lot of spurious questions about additionality in terms of the current forestry-based offsets that are out there currently. If you think about the amount of money moving through wood procurement markets, it's like most of it, right? So we really need to push on the demand side pull of differentiation, the types of claims, right, that Brad's talking about making. Like, this is our role as designers, is to be able to drive that aspect of market transformation. And to do it through procurement is ultimately a bigger key, right, because it unlocks more opportunities if done correctly. And who knows how much, of course, it's going to be able to modify it, but I mean, that's sort of the philosophical approach that I think about in that respect. But the one thing that's nice about the carbon offsets is that because it stays with the forest, it's a little bit cleaner in how you deal with carbon stock reductions for like a fire resilience kind of approach versus the kind of pure quantified carbon stock change that we're trying to do on the procurement side, tying landscape level carbon flux to wood products. In IFM accounting methodology, you get credit for both your carbon stocks and change over time, which is not something we figured out how to do on the wood product side yet. But we can take cues from that. We can start to think about creative ways to zero out those negative impacts. If you do know where the wood's coming from, you can make a legitimate claim that it's about carbon stock reduction for wildfire resilience. All those things come with, once again, transparency and knowing where the wood comes from. Sorry, that turned into a more complicated answer than I thought starting off.
Great answers. Thank you.
All right, well, we're past 1 o'clock, so I want to respect everybody's time. I want to thank our 3 speakers for coming. This was a really great update, and I think hopefully when you all sort of get more information, we can convince you to kind of come back and share those informations with us. We did record today's sessions, so we'll work on getting those up. I know I'm probably going to revisit and rewatch and to try and glean sort of more stuff off of the great presentations that we had. So thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.